Kathleen, I will have it known that Reclaim Hosting takes its introduction seriously.
No kidding. That was a heck of an intro.
We're not playing around. It takes a while, but we're not playing around.
Nope.
So, hi, everybody. I'm Jim Groom, and you're watching Reclaim TV. And actually, today we're continuing our series on writing. And I am really lucky because, as I said it before, Kathleen's always a gamer. Whenever I go to the well, she delivers. I'm here with Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who is currently the Interim Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies in the College of Arts and Letters at the Michigan State University. And that's just one of the things she has done at the Michigan State University. Up until, I think, July, right? 2024,
Yeah.
You were the director of the Digital Humanities and professor of English. And you actually, I haven't even said it, but you were part of MESH, I think a founding member of MESH, and you got the Digital Commons, Knowledge Commons now it's called, up and running.
Yes.
And you have done much, much more even before that. That's just like the last few years.
It's been a long career so far.
It has been a long career. In fact, it's a beautiful segue because what I've been doing in this series, and I hope you will kind of, how would I say it? I'm losing my words. I'm sorry, but I hope you will play along. I'll find that word. And I've been asking people to just give me a sense of how they came to writing. What's their path? Not only to the web, and I think we'll get to that, and to blogging, but what's your origin story, if you will?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so if we're gonna go that far back in my origin
All
story,
the way back.
Oh my God. I mean, I don't even know when I started writing, right? My mother has the scrapbooks with the little book that I produced about the duck when I was 5 years old. There's always been writing in my past. I think I started taking it somewhat seriously as an undergrad. And I was an English major with a creative writing emphasis, and so thought I was going to be the great American novelist, and then novels weren't quite the thing I wanted to write. So I did a bunch of playwriting and screenwriting and things like that, and very quickly figured out after I finished my master's, I moved to LA to go work in Hollywood, and very quickly figured out that I did not want to write for folks in Hollywood. I wanted to write about them. The things that were happening there were culturally just so interesting to me that I thought, okay, I could write about this nonfiction stuff for quite some time, but really felt like I needed a whole new vocabulary in order to be able to do that. So being utterly unimaginative about how to go about developing that vocabulary, what did I do? I went back to grad school and got a PhD in English. Which doesn't entirely align with what I wanted to do, but I don't know. I didn't have great advising, and I was sort of under the impression that having gotten a BA in English, the only PhD programs I was eligible for were English PhD programs. Why I thought that, I'm not sure, but anyway. And, I figured that having the PhD would allow me to do some teaching and sort of feed the writing habit, right? So it was always, it always like the PhD path felt to me like a means toward an end. But the thing that happens when you start in a PhD program happened to me, right? Which is that you get in there, you see the work that's going on, you see your professors and the things that they value, and you kind of gradually come to want to be part of that set of conversations, to be in that environment, to sort of remake yourself with the same career path that your advisors had. And so, I did a bunch of stuff while I was in grad school. I was on, this is going to sound weird to say that I was lucky, to be in this position. I was at NYU, my first year, totally unfunded. But
Wow.
it was lucky for me in that it pushed me to start looking for work outside the university, to think about like, what is it that, I might do that could just put some food on the table while I was doing this PhD. And I stumbled across a flyer on a billboard that said, or on a bulletin board outside the English department that said that they were looking for proofreaders. And it said nothing about like what the company was, like but I am I'm a proofreading whiz, right? I'm a magnet for typos. I find them everywhere. I thought, okay, well, I'll give this a go. I'll go ahead and send in a resume and see what happens. And it turns out, several months later, after my resume came to the top of the pile, they'd gone through several other people. I got invited to go do a proofreading test out in the middle of Queens somewhere in some warehouse where they set me up in front of a television set with, appropriately for your background, a Laserdisc machine attached to it, and had me do a proof of the Criterion Collection Laserdisc from, and I can't even remember now which film it was, but it was
This is
the background
awesome.
material. It was completely amazing. And
Oh my
I didn't
God.
even know this kind of thing existed, that there was stuff on Laserdiscs that that text about the production was there. It was amazing. And this was my first connection, my first introduction to the existence of the Criterion Collection. But it turned out that the folks that were doing this interviewing, that they were trying to hire proofreaders for, were the Voyager company. All right, so this was Bob Stein, who had co-founded Criterion, went on to co-found the Voyager company, which was producing all of those amazing CD-ROMs. Back in the day, they did the CD-ROM version of Mouse, and they did, I mean, just a whole ton of stuff. And so I ended up freelancing for Voyager in the mid-90s, doing proofreading and quality control, and eventually a little bit of production on some of their CD-ROMs for several years, and then went on from there to do some more of that kind of work for Penguin Electronic, and just had a fabulous time and recognized that like I had this whole skill set that could be brought to these other forms of writing, not just like the standard academic prose that I was producing, but there was this other potential career path for me that I kind of got set out down. So, I continued, I finished the PhD, I finished my dissertation, and because I am the luckiest human being on the face of the earth, I got a faculty job right out of my
They
PhD
still
program.
have those? They still existed
Well,
in the
this
90s?
98, yeah. So they did still exist at that point, but, fewer and farther between
Mhm.
as we keep going. But yeah, so I ended up in that job, and the job, as it turns out, was a position I was appointed in the English department, but was jointly appointed in media studies. And my work had that sort of English media studies crossover. My dissertation and the first book were really about representations of television in the American novel and what they had to say about the changing media landscape and the tensions in it and so forth. And so like
Cool.
all of the things that I had done, which felt like just background noise, right? I needed to do this work in order to eat, actually ended up feeding the scholarly work that I was doing in some really interesting ways.
How cool. I mean,
Yeah.
just the fact that you worked for the Voyager company. Bob, am I right with Bob Stein? Is he the same one who had his hand in like Atari and stuff like that? Or I'm totally wrong there. No, I'm wrong.
Atari, I don't know anything about,
No.
but no, I mean, I think, co-founder of Criterion and of the Voyager company, and then went on after that to found the Institute for the Future of the Book in New York.
Oh,
They're located in Brooklyn. And I ended
he
up crossing
he
paths
might
with them
be.
again much later. It, could well be because he
Yep.
did have connections out in the sort of California technology scene before Criterion came about. So
How
could be
interesting.
the
I
same
didn't
guy.
realize that. In fact, he's the one who came up with that comment press theme.
Yes, yes.
And you
So that
worked with
was
that with your
happening.
book.
Yeah, at the Institute for the Future of the Book, when we crossed paths again, I mean, I'm going to skip a big chunk of the story right now
We'll
because,
come back to it.
was,
That's fine.
right, there was blogging, and then there was me having posted this one blog post that was sort of mouthing off about the future of scholarly publishing and why couldn't it look more like blogs rather than like books that take forever to come out, that are expensive, that few people can get their hands on, and so forth. And Bob got in contact with me based on that blog post and said, "We want you to come out here. We want you to talk to us at the Institute about the things that you're thinking of."
Wow.
And so I ended up working with Bob and his team, just Ben Vershbow and Dan Vizel and a bunch of really fantastic people there, as they were working with Mackenzie Wark, whose Gamer Theory was the prototype for
Wow.
what turned out to be Comment Press, right?
I remember this whole moment is early on in my
Yeah,
time at Mary Washington. I remember it
yeah.
clearly.
It was an amazing time. It was a really heady moment. And one of the things that I was working with them on back then was we stood up Media Commons, which was for me a sort of eventual prototype for the thing that has now become Knowledge Commons.
Absolutely.
So it was my first experiment with thinking about what a scholarly social network might look like, how it might operate, and how it might enable folks to do their work more in the open and in direct communication with one another instead of being mediated by publishers.
So tell us a little bit about Media Commons. For those who don't know, what was the Media Commons and how did you set it up and why?
Yeah, so Media Commons, again, we set this up in collaboration with the folks at the Institute for the Future of the Book, and I was co-founder along with Avi Santo, who was at that time at Old Dominion University, now at University of North Carolina, I think. But we decided what we wanted was a network that scholars in and across media studies could join, could be in direct communication with one another, could build a profile, could participate in various kinds of projects that we set up, and could like allow the scholarship that was happening in media studies to move a little bit more at a speed that a little bit more resembled the media itself
Yeah.
rather than at the speed of print-based academic publishing. So the key project that we set up within Media Commons was one called In Media Res, which was 5 days a week, usually in themed structures, scholars posting a video that was just a clip of something that they were interested in or curious about with a quick post about it, and then ensuing discussion coming after that to sort
Wow.
of like really unpack what was happening. And it was just a vibrant project. I believe it's still going. I think it may be the only piece of Media Commons that's still like in active production. It ended up moving to a group of folks at Georgia State, who were doing some really great work there, when Abby and I both ended up moving on to other projects.
See, that's amazing. And so
Yeah.
this is interesting because it's kind of a foreshadowing of projects you will do and how your career will move when we talk
Yeah.
about the MLA and then the Knowledge Commons.
Yeah.
But let's talk about this moment in terms of, is this 2007? Is this when is let's position
Yeah.
this moment and then look back towards how you got into this whole blogging thing and then
Yeah,
come up to that
absolutely.
point.
Well, so this was about 2007 as we were establishing Media Commons. And like I said, I mean, the entire existence of this thing came out of me having written a couple of blog posts,
Right.
because I was really, I
That
was
itself
really,
is amazing, right?
yeah, well, completely. I mean, because
Yeah.
people read them and reached out to me based on that out of the blue. It was astonishing. And I mean, it was at around that same time that I was recognizing that all of this work that I had been doing on the blog was in fact generating citations. And there were my first citations. I had published articles in journals and I had, done other things, but none of that stuff was what people were paying attention to. It was really the stuff I was doing online, which made me then, think, well, gosh, okay, we need to rethink the foundations of scholarly communication in order to be able to take advantage of this sort of direct scholar to scholar connection that blogs make possible. But sort of looking back to where all this came from, so I started, as I mentioned, my first academic job at Pomona College in 1998. And Pomona had this incredibly generous junior leave program, right? If you successfully got through your third year review and got reappointed pre-tenure, your fourth year was a full year leave, which was amazing, right?
Wow,
But the
that's awesome.
expectation is we're giving you this full year leave because you've been teaching very intensely over the last 3 years, and now you have to get yourself ready to come up for tenure. So go off, go away, go write your book. So between 2001, the academic year 2001, 2002, I was on my leave and I was wrapping up my first book project, which was a heavy duty revision of what had been my dissertation. And I ended up really by about, June-ish 2002, I was kind of done with that project. I was feeling myself putting the final wrapper on it and getting ready to start sending it out to see like if the presses that I had been talking to were going to be interested in, if they were going to want to publish this thing. But I knew at the time that, it was going to take at least, a year or two before that
Yeah.
book would see the light of day. Side note, it was actually more than 4 years before it saw the light of day. So I'm glad I didn't know that at the time. But also, it was that 4-year lag that led to all the stuff that happened after that. But there I am. It's June 2002. At the tail end of this leave, I'm starting to think about what it's going to be to go back. I finished up this big project and I'm feeling like really the word that keeps coming to mind is stifled. In that, like I've spent now, I guess this project had been my dissertation. So I started it in about 1996. Between
Yeah.
1996 and 2002, working on this project that is now done and on my laptop and nowhere else in the world. And no one's read it. And I don't know how long it's going to be before anyone reads it. And I am desperate to get something closer to immediate gratification. I need to feel like there's some kind of response to the work that I'm doing, because otherwise, like, I don't even know. I don't know if people are reading it. I don't know if anybody's going to read it. I want to be in conversation with scholars and with other people thinking about these ideas. And I was just goofing off online one day and started searching for some old friends from grad school to find out what had happened to them and where they were. And I stumbled across one of my friends from grad school had this blog thing. And I had heard about blogs, and had a little moment of like, why on earth would someone want one of those?
I
What
had
would
that
you
moment.
do with that? Right.
What?
And
That's
this
so
is
stupid, is what I said.
exactly. I'm going to write every day about what?
Yeah.
June 2002, right? So I started reading his blog and it was hilarious. It was just these little, brief posts, sort of observations, little funny things from his work day or from whatever was happening around him, from the news, stuff he was commenting on. But the amazing part was that there were all of these people in the comments who were responding to him and that he was having conversations with. And I read this and I thought, oh my God, that's it. That's the thing that I have been looking for, is that way to do more frequent, more regular writing and have feedback that comes along with it, conversation that it can build, and so forth. So June, July 2002, I started a blog, and I was still untenured at the time, and so was a little bit cagey about who I was and what I was doing up until I got tenure, and then I was just like, well, whatever. So opened everything up. It was very clearly me. But I found the blog this really generative space to be able to think through some of the stuff that I was writing about in my book, but also a bunch of tangential things that didn't belong in the book, but that were connected in their way to the ideas about contemporary culture that I was really interested in. And I guess I was, maybe a little less than a year into the having the blog and posting relatively frequently, and I stumbled across this cluster of bloggers centered in and around University of Maryland. And kind of got connected to them. They called themselves the Word Herders, and they were this group of folks who had sites that were all hosted by this grad student in the English department at University of Maryland, who turns out, I mean, I was going to say later in life becomes, but he actually already was at that point, Jason Rhodey.
Oh,
Who goes
wow.
on to work at the NEH and then at
Sure.
SSRC, and is now at the Modern Language Association, and is now, 22 years later, one of my oldest and dearest friends. And we met through that blogging network. And it was, it was him, and it was Matt Kirschenbaum, and it was George Williams, and it was Chuck Tryon, and it was just like a whole series of other people that I got into contact with that became this network. I mean, they were literally networked together because they were all hosted on the platform that Jason managed. But I got connected to them, and we found ourselves responding to one another. Like, one would write a post, and then we'd write a response on another blog. And things were just
Yeah.
interconnected and dynamic. And it was like, if, you know, I think everybody who has any tendency toward nostalgia has some moment that they look back on and goes, that was the culture. That was the moment. And if I could have saved that, that would have been it. And that was
Yeah.
my moment, right? Would have been between like 2003 and 2006.
Yeah.
Blogging was just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. The emergence of that. In fact, you know, I my I had my first cPanel account in like 2003 because Zach Davis did something similar when we were in Brooklyn together. And he said, look, I just started this cPanel account, we call it Hippie Hosting, and you can get accounts. About a year and a half later, I remember Matt Gold came and we were kind of at a bar somewhere in New York. And he was like, I just, I've been following all these blogs and I started a blog called Tattered Coat. And I was like, what's a blog? That's the stupidest thing. And we were having this, usual like bar room, whatever, and like having talking and drinking. And I was like discounting it, like, we're grad students. We don't blog. We write books. We think. Meanwhile, I
Yeah.
never did any of that. But like it was great that moment in terms of just like we were like, what is this? Just even that. But your story
Yeah.
in terms of back to 2003 and Bob Stein, that is awesome.
It was a really, really amazing
Ah,
moment. And so the post that I had written that ended up getting Bob Stein's attention, that then got me connected into the Institute for the Future of the Book, was it was basically about the future of peer review.
yeah.
And so I had just been, and this goes back to the why my book took 4 years from completion to release to actually see the light of day. um, I had been in contact with a series of presses as I was revising the book that were all, there were three of them in particular that were very interested in the project. And we're like, when you're done with it, let us know. We want to read it. We're interested in
uh,
publishing it. That would be great. So I finish it up. But what's happened in the meantime is that first .com bubble burst, right? And university library and university press budgets just
yeah.
tanked. And all of a sudden, the three presses that had been interested in the year 2000 in 2002 were like, "Ugh, I don't know if we can afford to publish this. It's not really in a field. It's kind of between fields. And so we don't know how to market it. And oh, by the way, so and so published this book last year that's kind of similar, but it wasn't similar at all." And like, anyway, so I'm depressed. I'm demoralized. I'm trying to find a publisher. And I did in 2000, late 2002, early 2003, I think, got it in front of a press that was like, "We love it. Let's put this through the process." So they sent it out to peer reviewers, got the peer reviewer reports that of course requested some changes, but were by and large very, very positive. I wrote my response saying, "Yes, by all means, I would love to make the changes that you were suggesting because I think it will make my book stronger," as you do. And then all of that went to their editorial board. And the editorial board was not just editorial, right? It had the business folks on the board as well. And I ended up finding out from the editor literally 72 hours after I got tenure, right? Like, so I got notified on a Tuesday, "Congratulations, you have tenure." And on Friday morning, got a message saying, "By the way, we're declining your book because I've gotten overruled on the editorial board by the marketing team, who said that this book represents too much risk for us to publish in the current economy." And my mother, when I told her this story, said, "They were planning on making money off of your book?" Um,
Exactly.
which, I mean, on the one hand, thanks, mom. And on the other hand, suggested like, yeah, there's something wrong with that, isn't there? I mean, that just doesn't seem right. So I started doing all of this writing on the blog about what had happened and about paths forward and thinking about what an all electronic scholarly press might look like and the kind of things that it could open up for us. And one of the things that it could open up would be peer review. Like, what if we could do peer review in a means that was more like blog commenting and that kind of feedback rather than using it as a mode of gatekeeping? So I wrote this big blog post that ended up getting published on, and now I am completely forgetting the name of the blog. It was a group blog in literary studies that was run by John Holbo. Somebody out there remembers the name of this blog, I'm quite sure, but I'm completely forgetting it right
All
now.
right. We'll find it.
Yeah. And that was the post that Bob reached out to me. It's like, "I read this thing and this is exactly the kind of thing that we want to work on." And so this is how Comment Press becomes such a driving force for the work that I was doing going forward. And since then, like, I published that first book, finally did come out several years later. And it did
Was that
fine. Thank you very much.
The Anxiety of Obsolescence?
The
Is that the
Anxiety of
first one?
Obsolescence. That was the very first book.
Yeah.
But then the subsequent books, so I've published three more single author books since then. And with all three of them, I've used a similar process of actually publishing the draft manuscript in Comment Press to
Wow.
get feedback from the community that I'm most interested in reaching, and really thinking about, what it means for peer review to turn into a conversation
Yeah.
instead of this anonymized, vaguely threatening like experience of being told that you're doing it wrong. And it's been extremely productive for me.
Yep.
Um, I have been asked a lot of times, like, how I got brave enough to release my work, like, unpolished, unedited, out there into the world where anybody could say anything they wanted to say about it.
Yep.
And I have to say, it wasn't a matter of bravery. It was a matter of just utter naivete. I had this great community online and I thought everybody would just be like them, right?
Yeah.
And I've been very lucky in a lot of ways and have had just a boatload of privilege, precisely because the work that I'm doing, um, it isn't political in the ways that gets you swatted, right? It isn't political in the ways that draws significant internet blowback. It's got deep politics running under it, But my identity keeps me safe. And the nature of the work that I'm doing has kept me safe. And so, I have people ask me all the time, is this something that I should do? And I have to say, the internet is a different place now.
Yeah,
And you really,
absolutely.
really need to think about your safety before you start releasing stuff in the ways that I did.
Now, I wonder with your anxiety of obsolescence and then following that, I think is planned obsolescence, right?
Yes, that's right.
Now, with those, are some of those themes you're playing with in those books themes that we've kind of been revisiting right now with enshittification? Like, is that, I mean, I don't know if you see the parallel, but I always think about that parallel.
That's amazing. It makes a certain degree of sense to me. I can kind of see the connections. But I would love to hear your thoughts about how that connects
I
because
mean, because enshittification really makes a lot of these services, as we understand them, that Cory Doctorow is saying, kind of, we're no longer, they're obsolescent, right? Where they're kind of
yeah.
created themselves, or let me see if I can articulate this. They're making themselves obsolescent, and part of that is the drive to capital to squeeze
Oh
every
yeah.
ounce of
Sure.
value out of them. So
Right.
the idea of your notion of planned obsolescence may be different in that regard, but the whole
Yeah.
idea is the end game is the same, right? There's
Yeah.
no longer this service, right? For example, cPanel being bought by a kind of hedge fund, capital fund. What they're doing is just driving up prices and profit and
Yes.
kind of squeezing people out of the equation until eventually through that subscription model, you can't do it anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a great deal of sense. And I think I have to some extent been writing about gatekeepers and gatekeeping throughout my work, right? Planned obsolescence, or sorry, the anxiety of obsolescence, really focusing on this small cluster of elite novelists in American fiction between 1960 and 1990,
Yeah.
who were sort of positioning themselves against the main thread of mainstream American culture, which was moving increasingly toward television and really thinking about mass communication, mass broadcast. And so we're attempting to create a little sort of cultural wildlife preserve for the novelist as or for the novel as a space of elite activity, right?
Yeah.
And so end up in the novel writing about television as this force of decline throughout the culture. Right. I moved
Ah,
from there. I mean, the I don't know if this is funny or not. It's funny to me. I named the blog "Planned Obsolescence" based on the book the anxiety of obsolescence, which I had just finished writing it. But planned obsolescence was an inside joke for me because it was like I'm writing these posts and they're disappearing into the ether. I don't expect them
exactly.
to do anything. They're just they're all gonna die, so that's fine. But then as I got thinking about the ways that the blog's actual persistence, right, the fact that those conversations stay, I have the entire history, the 22-year history of my blog still available online. All those conversations, all those comments, they're all still there.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And they produced for me more more active thinking and more active transformation in the ideas that I was working with than me sitting alone writing journal articles or writing books ever possibly could. And so for me, the idea of planned obsolescence shifted from being like, oh, blog posts, they disappear out into the ether, they're evanescent, they go away, to instead thinking about the ways that are more traditional and apparently solid modes of communication through journals, through books, and so forth, were in some ways making the academy obsolete by pulling us outside the main threads of the ways that American culture was moving, that we weren't communicating in the ways that would allow folks online to see the significance of the work that we were doing on campus.
It's funny.
And yeah,
No, I'm just thinking because I thought you were playing on the idea of the way in which a lot of tech has obsolescence built into it, or
Yeah,
just like the
absolutely.
idea of the product itself, right?
Yeah,
More and more as we get into the plastic society, the product is obsolete, and that's a planned process. So maybe I was
exactly.
misreading that title. So I'm sorry.
Well, it's no, 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 no. I mean, I think that there's a. I mean, obviously, there's a deep connection there. That you think about the ways that. Um, I
You
mean,
don't have to salvage my misreading. That's
I'm.
my misreading. I need to own it. Kathleen, if I can't own my own misreading, who's going to own it?
Well, fair enough, fair enough. But I do think it's a generative misreading. How's that?
Thank you. You're the
Because I
best.
do think that you know what happens as soon as you've published a book, somebody is going to pop up with a review telling you why it's wrong,
Yeah,
right? And why
exactly.
it needs to move forward into something else. So you get this like 30 seconds of joy at the new ideas that are out there in the world that you spent years bringing together, and then immediately somebody's telling you how wrong you are.
Yeah.
And that's the nature of the book is to be obsolete by the time that it comes out in between covers. The ideas are already at least 2 years old just because of how the process works.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, beautiful. You saved me beautifully. That's an interesting
Nice,
kind
huh?
of art. Yes, very nice. That's an interesting argument for the blog versus the book, right? And that
Exactly.
ongoing idea. But it also brings us as we're going through plan anxiety of obsolescence, planned obsolescence. Now you're an established blogger. You've
Mhm.
actually now you're a tenured professor, but you change everything up.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're like, I'm not afraid. I'm
No,
going
I'm
full
out.
time. I'm changing it up.
Yeah, so it was at about the time I had been working on Planned Obsolescence, the book,
Yeah.
for
Not the
several
concept
years.
that I got
Not the
wrong.
concept and not the blog, but the book. And was in conversation. I had a contract with NYU Press and was working with Eric Zinner there, who was just a phenomenal editor and a delight to work with in all kinds of ways. And the book is about really shaking things up in scholarly communication, about using the affordances of the blog to change the ways that we do scholarship, the ways that we do peer review, the ways that we like all of that kind of thing. And so, as I was getting close to finishing the draft of the manuscript, I told him, look, I've been working with this group at the Institute of the Future of the Book, Institute for the Future of the Book. They've got this platform, Comment Press, and I want to put the manuscript into this platform to be able to do open peer review online. And we're on the phone as this is happening, and there's this long pause. And then Eric says, why would you want to do that? Well, I kind of make the argument for open peer review and for comment press, and I feel like I need to sort of put my money where my mouth is, so to speak. And so we went ahead and released it online and had this whole, I mean, really, really super productive peer review process. It's still all available
Yeah,
out there
crazy.
to see what that discussion looked like. Um, but as this was going on, I made the decision that I was going to go up for promotion to full professor based on that project online rather than waiting for the print book to come out. Because I really wanted to be able to pave the way for folks coming behind me at my institution to be able to have digital scholarship treated just as seriously as print based scholarship.
Well,
And I figured, I'm going up for full. They can't fire me. The worst thing that's going to happen is that I'm going to get my feelings hurt. I did get my feelings hurt. It was a little bit of a bruising process, but I did end up getting promoted, right? So, May, whatever that year would have been, 2010, I got promoted to full and I had a sabbatical in front of me. So I left, went on sabbatical, went to New York, and was doing some consulting with the Modern Language Association during that time. and ended up being asked to join the staff of the MLA, to be their first director of scholarly communication, to bring some of what I had learned, what I had written about in planned obsolescence, to thinking with the organization about the future of its publishing programs. And that doing that required me to walk away from tenure, right? To say like, I'm gonna give that up, and I'm gonna go have a boss, and I'm gonna have a 9 to 5 job, and I'm gonna work in an office in the financial district, and I'm gonna have a dress code and all the things that come along with that.
It's a brave
Um,
move.
yeah, I mean, it was a big move. But at the same time, I had obviously a bunch of scholars saying to me, like, how could you possibly walk away from tenure? And I just kept thinking, I know if I don't take this job and I continue in the role that I have right now, I'm going to be a full professor. I'm going to, have 25 years on my campus that are going to pretty much look the same, right? Like I know what I'll be doing for 25 years if I do that. Taking this chance opens up a whole lot of possibilities, for the kinds of things that I could accomplish. And, like most of the rest of the world doesn't have access to anything like tenure and seems to come through it okay. So I thought, you know what, let's just give it a shot and see what happens. And it was one of the most exciting and productive and terrifying choices that I've made in my career, was really deciding to do something completely different. I learned what it was to be a manager because I had a team reporting to me for the first time, which was crazy. I learned, how to genuinely chair committees, how to get a group of people to work with you to make something better. I learned how to read a budget and how to create a budget. I learned how to write a grant. I learned how to, like, that. Those years at the MLA were an extraordinary learning period for me, and also gave me this position to be able to see, rather than from the vantage point of an institution, what was happening in the academy, sort of the national view, like what's happening in our fields nationwide. And it introduced me into a lot of conversations that I would never have gotten to be part of otherwise. So I'm just enormously grateful to have had that chance and to have gotten to do the work with the fantastic people that I worked with at the MLA.
You are also the ambassador for the digital into that entire field and what
Yeah.
that meant. And
Yeah.
obviously, MLA can codify that for
Yeah.
those fields. So that's a very interesting, but also like defining position.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting moment. The MLA had some very, very early guidelines on, evaluating digital scholarship for tenure and promotion. But while I was there, I got to work with the Committee on Information Technology to really deeply revise those guidelines. Bethany Novisky at the time was chairing the Committee on Information Technology, so I got to work with her on those.
Yeah.
We got to think about, like, the MLA had some fairly standard publishing contracts for PMLA and for Profession and for their books,
Yeah.
that did all the things that standard publisher contracts do. They kind of assigned copyright to the press, and then gave authors a fairly restrictive set of things that they could do with their own work, but that they had to ask for permission for anything else. And we revised those contracts so that copyright remained with the author, and that
Yeah.
the MLA instead licensed the right to be first publisher, for this work, and allowed the authors to deal with the rights beyond that. And so really kind of began to model a way of creating a bit more equity for authors in scholarly communication space, to allow them to really retain their intellectual property rights, and because of that, to be
Yeah.
able to deposit their work in repositories,
Yeah.
without having to ask permission to do so. So
It's interesting too, because I have two questions for you. One, how did that era I'll call it an era at the MLA, impact your own writing digitally and otherwise. But then, two, it seems like at this point in your career, you made a bit of a shift to start thinking about where people store their work and how they
Mm,
manage their work. And you built a commons for the MLA to kind
yeah.
of rethink what a digital ecosystem for an organization like that might look like. See, I
Yeah,
did do
absolutely.
some of my research.
You did it good. It was great. No, it's true. I mean, that moment, so I was at the MLA between 2011 and 2017, and it was a time when there was a lot happening in open access and in really thinking about digital scholarship and how it was going to be dealt with. And one of the things that I came in with was, having had this experience with Media Commons, saying, okay, so what if we built something similar for the MLA that would allow the Modern Language Association to
Yeah.
host its own network, and to say that, like, where, years ago, the reason you joined your professional society was in order to get access to the journal, to be able to attend the conference, and to be part of that set of conversations that were happening there. What if we understood those conversations as being more literal conversations happening across the year, in ways that were digitally informed, that built on the work that happened in blogs or on Twitter or what have you, and that we created a space where folks would join the MLA in order to be able to participate in those conversations,
Yeah.
rather than just simply getting access to stuff. And so MLA Commons came from that. We got an initial sort of smallish grant from Mellon to be able to start up the first network. And where, MLA Commons, or I'm sorry, Media Commons, we had built in Drupal
Yeah.
back in the day, because it was at the time the most robust way of creating something that blended blogging with a scholarly network, or with a social network. At the
I
time,
forgive you for building it with Drupal. I
yeah, I'm
do.
not sure I forgive myself for it, but that's a whole other question. But by the time I got to the MLA, the CUNY Academic Commons had recently launched.
Yeah.
And there I was in New York, and I was friends with Matt Gold, and knew all the guys who were working on it, knew Boone Gorgas and that whole crew. And I kind of took Matt out. I think we may have gotten coffee, and we're sitting somewhere outside at NYU. And I said, Matt, I really want to build this thing for the MLA. And I want it to be like what you've done with CUNY Academic Commons. Have you thought about, like, abstracting what you
Yeah.
have done with this into something that you could release? And they ended up getting a grant to create what turned out to be Commons in a Box. And we were the first consumer of Commons in a Box. We built MLA Commons on top of that. And it was just phenomenal to be able to use WordPress and BuddyPress to do this kind of extensive and intensive, also, networking among the members of our organization. So
Yeah.
you had to be a member of the MLA to join that network. We launched it at the convention, the MLA convention, in January 2013. And within like 30 seconds, we had people saying, like, but I've got all these great collaborators who are in the American Academy of Religion, or they're in the College Art Association, and they're not MLA members, and I want to collaborate with them. So how do we get them to join this thing? And that was where the first, like, planning grant for what turned into Humanities Commons and then eventually became Knowledge Commons came from, was from this idea that, okay, networking within a society is super duper important, but we also need to network across societies and across institutions and make sure that people can find their collaborators wherever they may be.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because obviously the scale of that project now and the way in which you've explored various technologies, even beyond CBox or Commons in a Box, which is great. I mean, super interesting what the Fediverse manages for that. But you've also, I mean, I loved your work when you started saying, like, why academics are you putting your stuff in academia.edu? I think it was called, right? Like,
Yep, that's
and
the
like,
one.
I mean, there was really like this sense of, despite the fact that we have the open web and we can build these tools and organize as communities, all the impetus always seems to go, I'm going to put it in this new startup and lose all my
Right,
copyright and all my protections.
right,
Like, I mean,
right.
I thought that was a brilliant kind of move that you started writing about and kind of documenting what was happening in the field.
Well, and wraps us back around to enshittification, right? Because these are
Absolutely.
corporations that
Thank
are
you.
hoovering up content from academics who are like, look, it's a free platform. I can put my stuff on this free platform. And because it's free, anyone can access it here. But don't recognize that this is a venture capital funded platform that is eventually going to have to pay
Yeah.
the piper. And either it's going to shut down, or it's going to get sold for parts, or they're going to start mining your data in order to sell it to other people in order
Yeah.
to make the profit that they have to make their capital masters happy. And this is exactly what happened with academia.edu. It's what happened with Twitter. It's what happened with, like, we see it over and over again. And
Yeah.
that mode of, like, I mean, one of the things that Cory Doctorow has said in talking about enshittification is that it's part of the process of siphoning value out of a community and putting it into the pockets of shareholders. And so I found myself just infuriated by the degree to which folks wanted to point to academia.edu as being the place where they were making their work public, not recognizing that they were feeding exactly that process. So, yay open web, and like truly open web, not for profit open web.
Yeah, and it
In
was
this age.
strange that it was like, it's the Facebook for academics, and it's like that should be the surefire sign why you should run the other way,
Run
right?
away.
And
Absolutely.
run for cover, because that's a nightmare. So you moved on to Michigan State. You
Yes.
brought, like you said, the Humanity Commons, which then became the Knowledge Commons, to
Yes.
Michigan State as part of, your working there. But then you also started writing about a kind of new concept, I think, for you, and this idea of generosity and the
Yeah.
web in relationship to generosity. And I think that's kind of how I see you in your, current instance of, the web should be about generosity. We should be thinking
Absolutely.
about what this is. And I think you've made a really a beautiful connection that's also positive, because oftentimes we're surrounded by absolute negativity and we're all like, what are we going to do? My daughter's like, what am I going to do? Like all this stuff, and I'm just like, well, there is positive things too to
Yeah.
focus on and to build on,
Yeah.
and I think the web is one of them. So how did that writing go in your kind of move? Because you could have been negative. It'd be easy to be negative given what you've seen, but like you weren't. You took the high road.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that I am, for better or for worse, by nature, I am an optimist, and have a tendency. I mean, it's like that's getting a real workout this year. So I
Yeah.
acknowledge that even my optimism has some limits. But I tend to look around and want to lift up the good, right? That was a phrase
Yeah.
that Dan Cohen used in talking about like more open processes for scholarly communication, was like not using gatekeeping processes to weed out the bad, but instead looking around the open web and
Yeah.
figuring out where we can find the good and lift it up. And that for me is the essence of generosity, is really being willing to make your stuff public, being willing to be in open conversation in open spaces with other folks, and then finding the good in those conversations and making it more visible and more available to the folks around you.
Wow.
So yeah,
Right.
generous thinking kind of grew out of some of that experience, and really attempting to encourage, I'm going to use that word, other scholars to think about how they might do some of that more community engaged open work as well.
And then am I right in here? Like part of that generous thinking also leads to generous leadership, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea of, and now is that like where you find yourself now?
Um, yes, with some challenges in the present moment, as you might imagine. But yes, and so one of the things that happened, I wrote Generous Thinking. We did that same open review process. I got really great feedback. The book came out. I started doing talks. The book comes out in late 2019, I think. Early 2019, doesn't
2019.
matter.
Yep.
Sometime in 2019.
Yep.
And I was doing a bunch of talks all over the place. And I gave this one talk in particular at Virginia Tech. Was visiting all of their campuses and doing different things on the different campuses. It was this week-long thing that was just phenomenal. But on their main campus in Blacksburg, I gave the Generous Thinking talk, right? And at the end of the talk, had this one faculty member who said, like, I get it, right? Generosity is great, especially in good times, right? But what happens in bad times, right? How do we remain generous? How do we find the wherewithal to remain generous when our budgets are getting cut and when, all of this awfulness is surrounding us such that we have a tendency to retreat, like to everybody kind of grab a hold of what's theirs and say, I'm not letting go of it, right? How do we stay generous in bad times? And I just thought, holy moly, that is a big question and one I have not answered. And Leading Generously, the book that came out this last October, comes out of attempting to answer that question, right? How do we keep an institution or a project or a program moving in generous directions when times are hard, and when we recognize that we're facing challenges that are not going to be easily solved, that we can't just simply throw money at. So Leading Generously really attempts to think differently about leadership, to understand leadership as being not like a quality that I have, that I possess, but rather something that I build and that I share in collaboration and communication with other people around me. That leadership always has to be collaborative in nature for it to function, and that it can arise anywhere in the org chart, not just at the top. And that, in fact, some of the most important aspects of leadership that we see in our institutions today are really happening like on the ground. So that's where that comes from. And that's,
cool.
I guess, where I am today.
That is where you are. Now, I have one other question.
Okay.
You write a lot of, you blog regularly, and you're prolific. You've written 4 or 5 books, right? 4 books, 5 books.
4 books plus the MLA handbook, which I claim. But 8th edition.
5 books, 8th edition, the best one. So how do you balance? Like, when you start writing a book, does your blog suffer? Like, do you think of them as totally different things?
Yeah.
Like, when you talk about your own writing, like, I try and I kind of write in bursts on my blog and then stop, and then I'll write in bursts. Like, what is it like for you when you write?
Yeah. I mean, you'll see of late, the blog has become a good bit more sporadic. And that's less because I'm writing elsewhere than because my administrative life has taken over so much of my writing space. And I have found at moments, like when I was writing Leading Generously, I stepped away from the blog a little bit because it was hard to write in 2 different places and in 2 different modes at the same time. But with those last 3 books, with Planned Obsolescence, Generous Thinking, and Leading Generously, each of them grew out of blog posts because I found myself in the same way that I was mouthing off in that blog post that Bob Stein found it back in the day, right? Something was bothering me. And so I would write a blog post about it. And then a month later, I would write another blog post because it was still bothering me. And I was still thinking about that question. And I would, at a certain point, recognize that, wow, I've written a lot of blog posts about this thing. I wonder if this adds up to some kind of project that I should organize and think about in that way. And all 3 of those sort of went through that same process of really thinking like, oh, there is a project here, and maybe I should start thinking about it as a book. So the
So
blog, even if I step away from it while the book is becoming a book, um, the book required the blog in order to come into being.
how cool. So the
Yeah,
blog really was the place where a lot of them were formed, at least initially.
absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, now we are wrapping up, and I
Yes.
just want to ask you, do you have any advice for someone who's going to start writing, whether it's a blog or anything else? Kind of a blog, because that's what this series is kind of focused on, is
Yeah.
bloggers. Like, is it passé to start a blog in 2025? Is it too late? Was 2003, that was the time between
Yeah, no
2003,
kidding. Oh,
2006?
2003, you had to be there. No, I don't think it's too late. I don't think it's too late. I don't think it's passé. I think, I mean, I am still angry at Facebook and Twitter for having, on some deep level, siphoned the audience away from blogs. And having in particular moved like that dynamic of me reading people's blogs and responding to them on my own blog, all disappeared into Twitter and Facebook. And like that was the true obsolescence, right? That was utter ephemera and it's all gone.
Yeah.
So I miss those moments, but I don't think that blogging is or needs to be dead. It I think it can take all kinds of different shapes now. I mean, all the blog is really is this structure of sequenced posts, and they can happen at irregular intervals. They can be different shapes and sizes. They can have different purposes, different focuses. And so, folks who want to start a blog now or who are thinking about how to revive a blog that may have lain dormant for a while, I would really just encourage thinking about how your blog might connect out into other areas of social media space, right? Can you use the blog as a way of capturing your own permanent record of the more ephemeral thoughts that you would once upon a time have put on Twitter? Now you maybe post on Mastodon or on Blue Sky or wherever you're doing that kind of thing. Like, can the blog serve as the place where you archive all of that? Can the blog then be the place where those ideas develop into something more, and that becomes a space for drafting and for revising and for thinking through larger ideas? So that's, that would be my advice. Start that blog or revive that blog, and just think about it as a space where you can get your work out to the world.
Rock. Look, Kathleen, you truly are generous. I want to say thank you for joining us today, for sharing your kind of story, which I love to hear. And I know others do too. And so thanks again for coming
Oh,
and
Jim,
sharing.
thank you. As always, thanks for having me. This was fun.
You're awesome.
You are too.